the contract value. And it's worth reminding that the contract value is not the individual annual spend, it's the annual spend multiplied by the length of the contract that's been put forward. So in the bullet points on the on the covering report, there are some bullet points which just draw that particular change out, and you'll see that up to 50 is heads of service, 50 to 100 is ADs or directors where there are no ADs, 100 to 200 director and liaison with a cabinet member relevant for that portfolio, and then over 200 remains a key decision, and that would go in front of cabinet and through the forward plan mechanism. And of course, 200,000, say over a 5-year contract, is only 40,000 spend. So whilst 200 sounds a lot, once you extrapolate that figure over the term of the contract, it's actually relatively low value spend, but it's important that it stays in line with the constitutional review process that's looking at distinctions between key and non-key. As you've explained yourself, the mapping document, unfortunately, the reference points on the original mapping document were aligned to the contract procedure rules themselves. But of course, once the bundle of paperwork is put together, the page numbering changes to meet the whole agenda pack, and therefore the page numbers that were being referenced become irrelevant. So they've been updated. So it doesn't change the substance of the mapping document, which is trying just to give an overview of some of the changes between the CPRs as they exist currently that were adopted in January 20 and the proposed set that are before you today. So that's just to try and help members track the changes, which, as I say, largely are clarification and greater detail of decision making in the future. So I'll leave it there and invite questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chief Financial Officer. Any questions from members of the committee? Yeah. Councillor Stokes.
Thank you, Chairman. It seems that all of these are recommended additions, with one exception. We've got recommended amendments, but we have one little red item, which is absolutely meaningless, on 14.6.1, where it's talking about irregular tenders are those that. Well, that is all right, but the bit you've crossed out, I can't read because it's in red on yellow. It just doesn't make sense because you're not explaining what the irregular tenders are. Thank you.
Richard, would you be able to answer that?
Come back on that if there's just in case there's any other questions. I'll deal with them all together.
Okay.
Thank you. I've got 2 questions. Firstly, what assurances can you give that the council is protected from poor decision making? So, for example, do we have a secondary approval within the procurement process? And secondly, I understand at the moment the different teams, the different service areas are currently responsible for their own procurement processes. So would there be any advantage to considering at some point in the future a single procurement level, which might help with economies of scale and adherence to the rules, etc.? Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else got any questions? I've got a question. If no, okay. My question relates to on page 14. I just want clarification about the second paragraph. So 1.2 talks about the council has incorporated a dedicated procurement resource. I just want a confirmation that I know I spoke to Richard before about that. That is actually a person who's going to be looking after procurement generally, an extra member of staff, I think, isn't it? If you could just confirm that for me, please, Richard. Probably those are the only questions.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of the reference point, which refers to page 50 of the CPRs themselves, 14.6.1 goes into A and B, and it was just, so the reference point in red is identifying irregular tenders are those that, and then if you go to the document itself, there's a full sentence for A and there's a full sentence for B. So just in terms of presentation, it wasn't possible to put all that narrative into that box. So it's just making the point that 14.6 about receiving irregular tenders has been detailed out more fully to give further information around that. So the substance of that change is actually on page 50 of the CPRs themselves. In terms of going forward, so you're right in terms of at the moment procurement is done across service areas with individual responsibility for procurement within those service areas. But one of the reviews the officers have been doing is around a business support team. And the ultimate aim of that team is to centralise as much as possible procurement activity, because that could lend itself, as you've said, to economies of scale, but also in terms of efficiency. So rather than having potentially 20 single points of procurement officer, which is obviously then difficult to manage, train, develop, the objective ultimately was to have a more dedicated resource that would support procurement activity across the authority. In terms of the authorizations, obviously the ability would be for assistant directors and directors to support any awards down to the £50,000 level. So yes, it's set out that heads of service can approve up to 50, but in the absence of a head of service, or where there is a potential conflict or where they want to step away from the process, then we're going to allow assistant directors or directors to step into that area and manage that. And in terms of the procurement lead, it was part of the restructures approved by council in October 20 to put a dedicated resource into the structure. And that was to recognise the fact that the council still has some way to go around its procurement activity, which is not uncommon for authorities actually to continue to embed and develop and ensure that we're getting absolutely best value across all our procurement activities. So it was recognised it needed some resource behind it. And council approved a dedicated resource within the structure. At the moment, we're still having support from Welland Procurement, and that will continue for the rest of this financial year. But ultimately, the aim would be that we wean ourselves away from Welland Procurement, which is more off-site strategic support, and move into a space where we've got on-site dedicated officer and potentially develop that across the team that we've talked about as well. So that's the direction of travel we're aiming for. But I think it's encouraging to note that there is a dedicated resource now in the establishment for it.
Yeah, thank you for that, Richard. Just before I come on to Councillor Whittington, I wonder, are you quite happy with those, Councillor Stokes? I think we'd like to come back on that. Are you quite happy with what Richard said? Yeah. What about you, Vice Chairman? Are you quite happy with those? Have you got further?
Yeah, just I think that's very positive, and I think yeah, having a dedicated officer is definitely a good step forward, isn't it? And as you say, bringing things in house, and I like the idea that the business support team, as you say, there are so many advantages, aren't there, to sort of having fewer people sort of heading up a process rather than it being very disparate. So yeah, all sounds very positive to me. Thank you,
Councillor Whittington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'm obviously supportive of the review, because I sort of see from the last review was done in January 2020, and obviously this update is in line as part of the sort of the wider constitution review that's currently going on. Now, I know that in terms of the wider constitution, I know that's going to be subject to regular updates. I believe the suggestion was that it be done on an annual basis, any change to the constitution. I was just wondering, for going forward, in terms of the contract procedure rules, what sort of period is envisaged before they're next updated? Because obviously, if they are part of the constitution and the constitution is reviewed on a regular basis, what is the thoughts in terms of how these will be updated and when the next review will take place? Is just to get that alignment between these and the constitution. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Richard, would you like to?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the trigger points for the review were actually largely driven by working with Welland and the EU exit, which necessitated the need to make some changes. And as public regulation changes are made, then obviously we need to reflect those within our local rules, because ostensibly we're followed by public contract regulations rather than what we locally determine. I think it's appropriate that we do actively review them, but I don't sense that we'd need to change them too much and too often. So I think as a discipline, if there's an annual review, that's a positive thing. But I don't see significant changes being made on that sort of time basis.
Thank you for that. If I could just follow up on that, then obviously that's fine by me. We have an annual review of them, right? Well, things might change in the intermediate. So is it like a live document though? So if something did change, you presumably would have to alter it, but then we have an annual review yearly. Is that seems fairly sensible to me. So I'm quite happy.
I think you're right. It's got to be a living document, and officers in the council need to work to them. And if there are difficulties with them, or there's some compliance issues, or there's changes in legislation outside of our control, then clearly we need to react to that and respond.
Okay, thank you. Well, they're essential documents, contract procedure rules. It's essential that we do follow them. And I know they're quite comprehensive because it's almost 60 pages long. The recommendation is that we recommend the Constitution Committee. So do I have a proposal to accept the recommendation? Okay. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Whittington. Vice Chairman. Okay. So all in favour? Okay, that's unanimous, including. Okay, so we move on now to the next item, which is the risk register, strategic risk register. Who's actually going to take this item?
I'll take it, Mr. Chairman.
Right, thank you.
Okay, so thank you. This the risk register comes to the committee every 6 months or so. That's in line with the terms of reference. This will always be, let's go back to the early comments about a live document. This will always be a live document. There's never an end date on a risk register. It's about making sure the register reflects the environment of the authority, both internal risks, but also external influences as well. The register has ownership in terms of senior management, take responsibility for the individual themes within the register. And we moved to a thematic review as a committee about a year or so ago to move it away from a corporate risk, which was fairly static in terms of the risks themselves. There was a mapping exercise done, which moved into more thematic base, which does allow risks that are live and present to be categorized under those headings. And then as that risk has been eliminated, removed, mitigated, then they can move back out and we can keep it more up to date and more responsive in that way. The covering report attempts to set out the actions and the activities that have taken place since the committee last saw the register, and they're under each of the 7 headings of each of those strategic risks. And you can see in the main there's been significant progress made on those headings, and those activities reflect the control environment that's been established under each of those risks. In terms of the document itself, just to remind committee that the residual risk score is the score that has been placed on the risk itself after those controls have been implemented. So what we would normally have is a gross risk score, which will be the score the authorities exposed if there was no controls at all in place, and that's measured by impact and likelihood. And at the back of the pack, you'll see the table which attempts to clarify how we identify the scores, which obviously has a relatively element of subjectivity attached to it, inevitably, because it's not a formulaic process. But the residual score is a score that we believe the council is exposed to once those controls have been put in place. As I say, it'll always be moving forward. It'll always be changing. So the far right column are giving members some insight into progress that's been made, and there's some updated narrative under each of those headings, so members can see, as I say, what progress has been made and what's still yet to be done. So we do expect, as we move across, all these headings will change as the controls need to change, as the responses need to change, potentially the timelines. Some may have more urgency attached to them. Some may be longer term ambitions. It's very rare we can eliminate the risk. So it's more about risk mitigation and reducing it to an acceptable level. And you'll see that in all the residual scores, there is the positivity in terms of residual score sits either in the amber or the green. There's no residual in the red, because if it's still in the red, then clearly the controls we've put in place are not sufficient to deal with the risk itself. So that's the objective of that exercise. Following today, it'll come back to this committee in the autumn as part of that regular review. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Before I put it open to questions, I just want to make sure, because I must admit, this strategic risk register is a little bit, I want to make it sure that everybody on the committee is aware that it's not specific risks, because I must admit it can be a bit confusing as to what these risks are about. I don't know whether you want to say any more on that, Richard, just to emphasize, I know you did mention it, but to emphasize, we're not looking at specific risks, it's sort of themes, all common themes, or going through the organisation, isn't it? Because I know when you talk about risk, people immediately think of a specific risk, and that's not what this is about. I don't know whether you can emphasise that a little bit more for members.
Yeah, I think it's the risks themselves as thematic headings are trying to take a corporate perspective rather than, so the first one is around the internal control framework, which sits across the authority in all its service areas. So it's not a particular focus in one area of the council that's potentially got into internal control issues. It's taking a broader perspective. Some of the themes are internal looking and some are external looking. So supporting communities as risk 3 is obviously very externally focused on what the council is doing to support them. Transformation is about the MTFP of the council and how it's financially planning itself in the future, how it's responding to the changing environment, how it's having to adapt and adopt new practices. So they are deliberately sitting across the organisation, which does allow, as you say, particular risks in particular areas to be categorised under those headings, and the control response needs to reflect that. But it also allows those 7 risks to be more stable rather than a risk register traditionally being quite volatile and things coming into it and coming out of it relatively quickly. So the idea is it gives it some consistency.
Thank you for that. I think that's made it a little bit clearer. Right. Questions from anybody? Councillor Whittington.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, Richard, for that explanation, because obviously I'm assuming these strategic risks, these are the sort of areas that, if they go wrong, have a fundamental effect on the ability of the council to function. And obviously at the strategic level are very much the concern of this committee, and also should be something concern of all councillors. I'm assuming that beneath this level, we have operational risks in each department as well, which are, I'm guessing, managed by the heads of service. If you just confirm that, Richard, and also do those operational risk registers, do they follow the same format as this in terms of using the same risk matrix, risk and scoring matrix? Thanks.
Richard?
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, sitting under this are very operational specific risks that are managed by the heads of service and the leadership team within those service areas. So they can be the semi-business as usual. They could be about IT. They could be around legislation that's affecting that service area. It could be about staffing. It could be about training. But yes, the methodology for identifying the risk and to eliminate or mitigate that risk are very much around gross risk and residual risk scores and those controls, but they're not within the sphere of the responsibility of this committee, because you would be absolutely swamped with risks that, frankly, staff are being paid to deal with and respond to, but they do sit under the skin, if you like, of this strategic risk register.
If no further questions, right, we've got a recommendation. Governance and Audit Committee is asked to note the contents of this report and review the updated strategic risk register and Appendix A. So do you have a proposal for that? Well, I'll propose it from the chair. So do you have a seconder for that? We got well, Richard will second it. Okay, so all those in favour, please. Okay, that's unanimous, isn't it? Approved. So then we can move on to the next item, which is item 7, financial regulations review. That's you, Alison, isn't it?
No, it's been, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, that's fine.
So this is following in the footsteps of the contract procedure rules. So these two documents are very closely aligned. Obviously, all this review is in the context of the Constitution review, as you mentioned at the start. So again, this document will be going to Council in May. I'm pleased to say the mapping document on this one does work, because the page numbers of the financial regulations have stayed. So hopefully that mapping across is more helpful to you. The changes on this one have been largely done in response to, as Councillor Whittington talked about, really, that these are embedded across the authority, but we see and hear some frustrations with how operationally they're working. So this document review has been largely driven by feedback from our own officers and to some extent from members as to where it's not clear, and where there needs to be some more clarity or transparency around how these work in practice. So again, on paragraph 3 of the covering report, they are a summary of the key changes that are being proposed. The first one being around external grants. Now, the council's been successful over a period of time in securing external funding, which is obviously very positive, but some of the difficulties have been had where the application or award has come without any visibility of the implications of that award. And members will be aware that we've had some examples where we've been having to come to council to get approval for receiving grants, such as the Green Homes grant was one, the Changing Places grant was another. So what this is asking to do is that the application, before it goes into government office or department or wherever that application is being made, is that it is signed off by the appropriate staff within the organisation, just to make sure that everybody is cited on the application being sent in and basically the implications for the authority should it be successful. So it's not seeking to stifle or prevent grant monies being sought, but it's making sure that there's full visibility and transparency of that application going in, because normally with grants there are conditions attached which could have legacy implications for the authority in terms of its financial responsibilities, or whether or not there are some exit costs or other unforeseen implications. So it's just making sure that process is end-to-end tracked. There's some changes to environment levels, which is where we seek to move monies between permitted cost headings, and that's just to bring those environment levels consistent between capital and revenue. But again, they're referenced in the mapping document. We've made some amendments to the in-year budget framework as the existing financial regulations allow for Cabinet to authorise in-year changes to the budget framework without recourse back to Council. And again, we've just sought to clarify what that heading is, that amount, to provide, again, further clarity. And we've also clarified how we can access discretionary reserves, as Council sets out a number of reserves that it has for particular use. So, for example, there's a regeneration reserve, there's a maintenance reserve, there's a street scene reserve, etc., etc. So again, it's seeking authority for those reserves to be accessed depending on the value and depending on the use. The financial regulations make clearer how those reserves are accessed and the route in which they can be used going forward. And then finally, there's just amendments to the authorised limits, and there's amendments to the write-off table as well, just to make, again, give further clarity. Just worth saying on this one and the contract procedurals that following approval by Council in May, there will be a full rollout of training to ensure that all those concerned are fully brought up to date with the implications of those changes, to make sure they work towards the new rules should Council choose to adopt them at the May meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I think the changes what you mentioned about grants is particularly valuable because I know for myself there can be a temptation if grants are available to grab the grants, but it's important to realise that are you going to be able to deliver it? And usually, like Richard said, grants come with conditions. So there is a temptation to grab the money, but is it enough money to do what you want, and can you deliver it? So I think it's right to look at that, and that's a very sensible way forward. Richard, you talked about training. Did you mean training for members and officers, or both? Because obviously it affects both, doesn't it?
Yeah, certainly for cabinet, there's more of an impact on cabinet colleagues in terms of their areas of responsibility, where their authority sits and where they need to be either consulted or asked to make decisions around. But I think in terms of the broader point about the local government finance training that's rolled out to members, it's certainly something that we'll be picking up to make all members aware of the existence of these documents. And I think it's worthwhile all members just familiarising themselves with the documents, even if they're not directly influenced or involved by them, because it just helps them understand better the financial framework in which the council operates. I think that's always a good thing.
I agree. Thank you, Richard. Any questions for Richard? No. Are we happy to accept the recommendations? Do you have a proposal to accept the recommendations, please? Councillor Stokes, and a seconder. Councillor Whittington. All in favour? Okay, that's unanimous again. Thank you very much. All right. I mean, the next item is item 8, delivering good governance. That's Graham, isn't it?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. An external review was undertaken back in 2019 in relation to good governance by an external consultant. The outcome of that review was reported to this committee, and an implementation plan was approved by this committee at that time. That was in November 2020, and I think at that time of following the review, significant changes occurred to the authority, mainly the appointment of a new chief executive and the development and adoption of a new corporate plan, which actually had a significant impact on the actions that were outlined as part of the review. So the action plan or implementation plan is attached at the in the appendix attached to the report, and there are actions setting out where the relevant items have been updated. Given the recent peer review, the Local Government Association Corporate Peer Challenge, that represents a much more up-to-date review, further to the external review undertaken in 2019. So we felt it was relevant to provide this committee with a closure report on that previous review. So this report effectively outlines where we are in terms of the actions in relation to the external review. So subject to any questions from members or any areas that members identify as requiring any further action, the intention is that this is the final report on that particular review. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Graham. Any questions for Graham, or any areas where you think you want further review on the report? Seems okay to me, but Councillor Whittington.
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, obviously, you just have to read through Appendix A to sort of see the level of change that's going on, in the council at the moment, and sort of moving in the right direction. So it's all positive. And obviously it's coming back for an update. So I think it just marks the good progress so far, and obviously this committee to be updating progress going forward. Thanks.
Yeah, I would add my congratulations onto that as well. There are always things that we need to improve on, and I think the way we're going, we're making very good progress going forward. There are always things we could do better, but I think the progress we are making is excellent, and that report shows it. So I quite welcome it, and I have no problems with it at all. Vice Chairman wants to ask a question, please. Kathy.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could have a bit more information. Page 209.10. The monitoring officer with the support of councils, etc. The end-to-end decision-making process. So it talks about the development of new processes and procedures, including development of a new report template and revision of practices. Just have a bit more information on that one.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, that's more of a kind of an internal process. I think we've got a good setup in principle in relation to report sign-off, with cabinet members taking ownership of reports. But I think internally it can be a bit more efficient. Certainly as officers, some things do kind of tend to not be as slick as they could be. That's an internal management thing that we can we can address. So that's something that we're looking at doing now, and even redesigning the report template to make it a bit more user friendly for everyone concerned in terms of those writing reports, but also those reading them. Just those general principles really are behind that particular action.
Right, thank you. I've just got one question, Graham. I noticed it's only a small question. I know on the recommendation and on quite a few of these, it says we note the contents. Why not approve the contents? Is there a reason why? I'd be quite happy to note or approve them. It doesn't matter to me, but is there any reason why we should note it and not approve it?
Or accept either really, Chairman.
It's just playing with words, really, isn't it? So it doesn't really matter. Okay, so I'll stick with what the recommendations is, that the Governance and Audit Committee note the contents of the final report and the progress made against the implication plan following the external review into delivering good governance, and identify any areas where further action is required. We've not identified any areas, I don't think, but required. So I'm quite happy to propose we accept the report. Could I have a seconder, please? Councillor Whittington. Okay, all those in favour, please. That's unanimous again. Thank you. We'll move on to the next item, which is partnership governance policy, item 9. I presume that's you again, Richard, is it?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, following a review of the arrangements for the council, external audit identified that it would be best practice if the council had a partnership policy, and the idea of the policy is to ensure that the council has a consistent approach in how it manages partnerships, either entering them, exiting them, or being a key player within those partnerships. So the policy before you is to attempting to set out a structured approach to how the authority manages its partnerships. That's in terms of having a central register of all the key partnerships that the authority is an active participant of. Also identifying who that lead officer is to ensure that somebody's holding the ring on that partnership, and there's a nominated officer who has all that relevant information. How we manage those partnerships, where our responsibility lies, whether or not there's any financial implications for the authority, reputationally, how the council participates in that, whether or not from a budget setting perspective, there is a need to reflect those partnership obligations within that annual process. But also in terms of how we and when we enter into new partnerships, are we fully cited on all the implications of it? And are we cited on our role within it? And that also extends to when we might be the lead authority. And we've seen that on some local examples, such as the Blue-Green Corridor, where we're the accountable body working with other authorities, but we are accountable to central government. So we play a very active role. And also importantly, when we can exit partnership arrangements, what's that process look like? Who's got that authority? What are the implications for the authority as a result of exiting, and when's the right time to exit? To support all of that, we've developed an annual health check document, which is appended to it, and that operates on an Excel basis. So each of those headings has a drop down, and there's a expectation that that lead officer can score against that, and that gives basically a web diagram picture of where we may be vulnerable or weak or uncertain about some of the information. The intention is that our colleagues in Democratic Services will hold the register, and I would expect routinely this committee will be updated once the register has been formulated, and to monitor and track the register thereafter. There's also an expectation that annually all the partnerships will be reviewed in this way, just to ensure they remain fit for purpose, or where there are either concerns or weaknesses in the arrangements, then they can be identified and dealt with. So post it, should this go through this afternoon, then we will start the work on the formulation of that register and bring that back to the committee at a later date. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I think it's good to have a partnership government policy, it's governance policy. And I think I'm right with this is the first time we haven't had one before, have we? So previously we've had no governance policy on partnerships at all. And the second thing I'd like to emphasise is, because I was a little bit unsure when I first read it, this doesn't apply to the council-owned companies, does it? This is nothing to do with those. It's partnerships with other local authorities or other partnerships, but not our own companies, which is, I think you told me it was like that's a service contract with those, which is excluded from this. But I welcome it. So, any questions, Councillor Whittington?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think it's a very good move forward. Just a bit of clarity on a couple of things. In terms of partnerships, I'm presuming we're referring to a situation where we're agreeing to share the provision of a service or enter into a specific project. Would it cover sort of just general transactional transactions? I'm thinking potentially we probably do have, for example, a lot of sort of day-to-day transactions with the county council, but would you say that that's a partnership, or would it have to be the fact where we were sharing services with the county council or involved in specific projects? It's just that criteria for what is meant by partnership. And secondly, in terms of going forward and the matrix and the scoring of that, and you said, Richard, that it's heads of service to score it. Is there any sort of check on that scoring? Just because obviously you get a number of managers there, and some people might score something slightly different to the others. I'm just wondering what the sensitivity around that is, and if there's any sort of checks and balances around the scores. Thanks.
Richard?
Yeah, in terms of partnerships, yeah, it's very much not just intended to be business as usual, day-to-day service delivery type arrangement. So, for example, the council uses another organisation for its payroll service. We wouldn't see that under the context of a partnership. That's got a formal arrangement with SLA and underpinning kind of contractual obligations on both sides. So it wouldn't be that type of activity. It would be where partners, be it public or private sector, are coming together to fulfil a particular ambition. So future high streets would be an example of where we want to seek to ensure the right governance was in place, is clear lines of accountability, the council's clear on its role within that, and everybody's cited on the full implications of that partnership and the lifespan of it, because clearly some can run for a period of time and some are relatively task and finish. In terms of the scoring, then we'd expect that to be done at a relatively senior level, but also Democratic, who will be receiving the information. Hopefully there's a level of mediation that we can build in to ensure that across the piece there is levels of consistency in how people have approached the scoring and how people have interpreted the questions that are being posed. So we've got a level of consistency, but the lead officer would be the expectation would be there'd be at a relatively senior level, so we'd expect that to come through on the scoring as well.
Vice Chairman's got some questions, I think.
Hi, yes, I think this is a really great idea. Just a question again about the scoring. So I think the way that the -4, the -2, the 0, 2 and the 4, I think that's a really clear and simple way for people to fill it in. My question is, some of these appear to be sort of nice to have. So the management of projects, including responsibility for key tasks, is clear and concise. Or does the partnership's plans and outcomes make positive contributions to corporate priorities? Lovely. However, are there arrangements in place to identify, is the clarity on confidentiality or handling of confidential information or transfer of ownership? Is it clear who will own assets after the partnership ends? I mean, they're like vitally important. So I'm wondering if could there be something that sits behind these numbers, you know, a sort of a waiting process, so that actually this is channeled through. I mean, you wouldn't want to make people do that because people just want to say whether or not they agree with the statement. But if there was some weighting behind it, because then you would get a much clearer ping, wouldn't you, about if there were serious issues. And it might also stop you having to look through every single line. You know, if there was like a scoring behind it that gave you an overall percentage or something for each area. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
I think it's fair to say that within each of the segments, if you like, some of those feel like they're more important and more critical to understand than potentially others. So certainly we can look at the weighting. I think similarly as well, if people are slightly indifferent on their knowledge of it, so they kind of sit on the fence a little bit by putting zeros, then this will be a continual loop. So it wouldn't just be received that scored in a particular way. There'll be an expectation they'll go back and source that information as well. So if they in their first pass, if they go, actually, I don't really know, or I'm not really sure, so I think it's this, then there will be an expectation that they need to go away and source that information from colleagues around the partnership table, or to go through, because most of the partnership information should be either in key documentation, or others around the table will have that level of knowledge themselves, because this has been adopted across other authorities as well within the area. So we've got living and breathing examples of where this is now embedded, so we can learn from where others are adopting this and understand where we probably get some ambivalent responses or indifference to some of those questions posed. But I think there is a particular, and I will say this, but potentially around the finance and the risk, they're probably big areas that we'd want to be really certain about. And I think if people are just zero in it because they don't really know, that's not really going to be acceptable. They're going to have to go away and find it. The other thing about this is we'd want to develop some more narrative. So rather than it just being a score, we'd expect there to be some commentary to support it. So if they scored it in a particular way, we'd expect a comment around why they scored it in that way, but more importantly, what they're going to do about it to either identify the information or what mitigations the council could put in place to strengthen that if it's an area of concern.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of these you shouldn't be able to put 0 or below, should you? Because if you need to put 0 or below, then it shouldn't be occurring on some of these points. I think it'd be really good for us here, because if we can look at this, then the questioning on different partnerships can be really very specific, can't it? Because we can look at specific things and it will flag things up to us. Are there any red lines? I mean, which of these, I didn't know if there was any significance about a couple of these boxes being in red on the left-hand side. Are there any of these that you would sort of say, oh, we need a meeting today, this is a disaster? Like which are the ones that you would say are the really key ones?
I think as well, just before I answer, there's going to be a migration, because what we're doing is seeking to adopt this within existing arrangements. So this is more powerful actually when we start to enter new partnerships, because this will be our validation of whether we feel confident to make the leap into the partnership, because we might go back and say there's so much uncertainty around this area, or we need further clarity on this point before we can formally enter it. So I think it becomes more powerful as we look ahead. So I think when we're going to try and implement it and place it on existing, then it might be a little bit bumpy, because we're overlaying it into existing arrangements, which might tell us actually there are some real concerns, because suddenly we realise there is no exit strategy from the partnership we're in, or suddenly there are some contingent responsibilities and liabilities on us that we weren't aware of at that time. So I think we're going to have to work our way through that to some extent. But at the end of the day, I think we are talking about a handful here of partnerships. We haven't got a plethora of partnerships. And these are significant partnerships we're talking about, rather than day-to-day service delivery type ones. So I think, it is containable, but I think we do need to just caveat this piece of work, as I say, overlaying it, the fact that we are putting it across existing arrangements as well as before we embark on new ones. But I think, those red lines, I think, will be more about the reputational and financial risk the authority may be facing as a consequence of whether or not it wants to withdraw itself from them.
Is the Vice Chairman okay with that?
Very happy, thank you.
Right. Could I ask you, Richard, did you say other councils are using this? You've not devised it from scratch, have you? You've adapted it from what other councils are already using it, so you have knowledge of its use and how it's been used in other councils, rather than?
Yeah, we've deliberately worked with other authorities to know where this type of model has some impact and actually serves that purpose, rather than just start with a blank piece of paper. So I think that's really helpful for us to adopt it and adapt in the way that's been discussed.
Is there any further questions on that, or do we move to the recommendation? I think we move to the recommendation, don't we? The Governance and Audit Committee is asked to approve the partnership governance policy. So Vice Chairman's first to propose it. Do we have a seconder? I'll second it. All those in favour, please. That's unanimous again. Thank you. Work programme, item 10. Now, one thing that I've got to say on the work programme. We've got it listed for section 106 update, but the actual issue, as it states in the work programme, to provide an update on the status of section 106 funds. I'm pretty sure that that's not what we're looking for. It certainly wasn't what myself and the vice chairman were looking for. We were looking for more, not just what the funds are, but the process of issuing 106, because previously there has been problems, or we've anticipated problems or seen problems that some of the section 106 funds are allocated parish councils, and so it's the process more than just the funds. What we didn't want was a report coming back to us that just listed what the funds were for 106. So it's the process, and I think we would agree with that. Any questions, Councillor Whittington?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I know when I was on this committee, that was very much the intention. The fact is that the committee looks at the policy and the failures in policies, not interested in the actual amounts, but they should go to the screening committee, which is probably to planning, so they can keep an eye on the actual numbers. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Whittington. Are there any other questions or comments on the work programme? We're happy to accept that work programme then and move on. I think we're going to item 11. Any other business? I have no other business. So I think we can say thank you very much for attending. That's the close of the committee. Thank you very much. Short meeting. Thank you.